They used to call Corporal Lyra Kane a token recruit, claiming she landed her billet through politics, not precision. 2 years later, 8 Navy SEALs were bleeding out in a militant ambush with no air cover, no reinforcements, and a radio screaming into silence. The only weapon within range was in the hands of a 27-year-old woman they had dismissed long before meeting her. What she did in those next 4 minutes would prove that bias doesn't just insult, it destroys. Lyra Kane was 27 when the transmission came across a channel she wasn't even assigned to monitor. She was alone in a rocky overwatch nest along the eastern ridge of the Kavara Valley, 11 months into her deployment with a Marine Corps infantry battalion in Zareth Province, Arkansas. The October air at that altitude bit with cold, and below her stretched the same rugged terrain she'd watched for nearly a year. Gray stone ridges, scattered pines, and winding dirt roads threading through villages where danger and civilians blurred into one indistinguishable heat trace. And before anyone asks, she wasn't a SEAL. She wasn't Special Operations. She was a Marine Corps designated marksman attached to a line company, a rarity for a woman in 2016, and she had fought hard for that slot. If you're watching this from somewhere that values that kind of grit, drop a comment and tell us where you're tuning in from. And if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, because there are more than you'd think, and most never see daylight. Lyra grew up in eastern Oregon on a cattle ranch resting at the foot of the Wallowa Mountains, and her father, Ethan Kane, a retired Marine infantryman, taught her to shoot before she ever got behind the wheel of a car. Ethan had served 2 tours in the first Gulf War and came home with a simple creed. If you're going to do a job, you do it right, or you don't do it at all. He trained Lyra the same way he'd been trained, long, punishing hours on the range with iron sights and wind calls, firing at distance until her shoulder bruised and her breathing became instinct. By 16, she could read her own wind at 600 meters and hit steel so consistently that local hunters started asking her dad where he'd found his spotter. At 19, she enlisted in the Marines with one goal: to prove she belonged in combat arms. The infantry had only just opened to women, and the road ahead wasn't easy. Lyra pushed through the School of Infantry, earned her Zesio 311 Rifleman MOS, and fought for a position as a designated marksman. She scored expert on every qual, completed the marksman course at Camp Redstone, and was assigned to a line unit armed with an M110 semi-automatic sniper system, a 7.62 millimeter platform effective out to 800 meters, if the shooter knew what she was doing. Lyra did 7.62 millimeter platform, effective out to 800 meters, if paired with the right shooter and the right ammo. Lyra had both. She trained relentlessly with match-grade M118LR rounds, studying how wind rolled off terrain, and spent more hours behind the scope than anyone else in her unit. Her instructors noted her uncanny calm under stress and said her fundamentals were textbook perfect. What drove her wasn't medals or fame. It was the same discipline her father had lived by: precision, patience, and the understanding that a single shot might decide whether someone lived or died. The trouble began 3 weeks before the ambush, during a joint mission brief at Forward Operating Base Halberd. Lyra's battalion had been tasked to provide overwatch for a SEAL element assigned to capture a high-value target in the Upper Kavara region. The SEAL leader, Senior Chief Rowan Hale, made his position clear from the outset. He didn't want a Marine marksman attached to his team, and he especially didn't want her. He didn't voice it in front of everyone during the meeting. He waited until the room cleared, leaving only the company commander. Hale told the captain his team already had organic sniper support and didn't need reinforcement from someone unfamiliar with their tactics. Then he turned to Lyra and said bluntly that he wasn't comfortable having an untested shooter in a post that could endanger his men if things went sideways. The captain didn't flinch. He reminded Hale that Lyra had logged more observation time in that valley than anyone else in the room, and that her position would remain independent of SEAL movement. Pure overwatch. No direct engagement. Hale wasn't swayed. He claimed experience wasn't the problem, though everyone knew it was. His look said it all. She was a liability by default, and if anything went wrong, the fallout would land on her first. The captain ended the debate, making it clear that Overwatch fell under Marine Corps authority and had full approval from battalion operations. Hale could accept that or take it up the chain. He chose to accept, but the air in that room stayed thick with tension. Lyra didn't say a word. She'd learned long ago that arguing only dug holes. Respect wasn't earned by talking. It was earned by showing up and performing when it counted. That night, she sat on the roof of a concrete bunker, cleaning her rifle beneath a sky so clear she could see the far ridge glowing under starlight. Her thoughts drifted to her father, and the first time she'd missed a shot that truly mattered. She'd been 14, hunting elk in the Wallowas, and had rushed a 200-yard trigger pull because she feared the animal would move. Her father hadn't yelled. He'd simply told her, "Fear makes you rush, and rushing makes you sloppy, and sloppy gets people killed." Only now did she fully grasp what he meant. The fear wasn't failure. It was the fear of being seen as someone who didn't belong. And that kind of fear made you desperate to prove yourself too fast. Lyra had spent years unlearning that impulse, slowing down, trusting her training, and letting her work speak louder than any argument ever could. But sitting there in the dark, with Rowan Hale's words still echoing in her head, Lyra felt that old anger begin to rise. Not aimed at him exactly, but at the fact that no matter how many rounds she sent downrange, someone would always see a liability before they saw an asset. She thought about the Marines in her unit who trusted her, and about the captain who had backed her in that room, and she made a choice. When the time came, she told herself, she would do her job, and do it so flawlessly there would be no room left for doubt. 72 hours later, the operation launched under a moonless sky. The SEAL element inserted by helicopter into a village 12 kilometers north of the base, and Lyra moved into her overwatch on a ridgeline about 800 meters to the east. Her hide was a shallow depression between two boulders with a clean line of sight down into the valley. She settled in with her M110, a spotting scope, plenty of ammo for a long engagement, and a suppressor to help keep her signature low. The cold bit through her gloves, and the scope glass fogged a little until her body heat steadied the optic. The plan called for a 2-hour window. The SEALs would clear the village, secure the target, and exfil before dawn. Lyra's job was simple on paper. Early warning and precision fire if hostile forces approached the objective from the east. For the first 90 minutes, everything ran to the script. Then the radio traffic shifted. The SEAL element had made contact inside the village, and the situation was going bad, fast. What should have been a clean surgical raid turned into a close-quarters fight, and enemy fighters began closing from multiple directions. Lyra could hear the strain in voices over the net. Short, clipped calls asked for air support, and were told rotary assets were grounded because of weather up north. Rowan Hale's voice came through, calm but strained, reporting 2 casualties with tourniquets in place and requesting CASEVAC immediately. The answer was blunt. CASEVAC was scrubbed until conditions improved. Then Lyra heard Hale's voice break up on the radio. His team was pinned in a compound with at least 20 fighters closing from the west and north. They had 2 wounded and no way to break contact without suppressive fire. He called for immediate support, and there was none available. Lyra scanned the valley through her optic and saw movement. Multiple fighters advancing in a loose skirmish line toward the SEAL position, using folds in the terrain for cover. She could make out their rifles, AK-pattern weapons with black canvas slings, and they were moving like a fighting element, not civilians. The distance sat just over 700 meters at the outer edge of her effective range, and gusting winds were making the shot trickier across the ridge. Lyra keyed her radio and identified herself to the SEAL Tactical Operations Center. She told them she had eyes on hostile movement and could engage. She read off her grid, the target grid, the range, and confirmed positive ID on armed fighters advancing to assault the compound. There was a pause. Then Hale's voice returned, rough and skeptical. He told her to stand by for clearance. Gunfire intensified over the net, and Hale's transmission cut off mid-sentence. Another voice, younger and out of breath, came through saying they were taking fire from multiple angles and urgently needed suppression. Lyra didn't wait. Through her scope, she saw the fighters closing within 50 meters of the compound, and she knew that in less than a minute the SEALs would be overrun. She adjusted for elevation and wind, dialing in the data she'd memorized after weeks of training in that same valley. She steadied her breathing, felt the cold metal of the bipod lock against the rock, and squeezed off her first M118LR round. The bullet struck the lead fighter square in the chest at 730 meters. He went down instantly. Lyra cycled the action, shifted aim, and fired again. Another hostile dropped. She worked with a rhythm that felt mechanical. Inhale, exhale, squeeze, follow through. Every shot deliberate, every motion practiced. The enemy formation broke apart, scrambling for cover, desperate to locate the unseen shooter tearing them apart. Lyra shifted fire toward the northern slope, where another group tried to flank the compound. 3 more rounds in under 20 seconds. 2 hits, 1 survivor crawling behind a wall. The pressure on the SEAL position broke almost immediately. Rowan Hale's voice came through the radio again, this time steady and sure. He confirmed that hostile movement had stopped, that his team was regrouping and preparing to extract with their wounded. Lyra held her overwatch for another 15 minutes, scanning for any follow-on threats until the SEALs reached their exfil point and lifted off. Only then did she break down her position and begin the long trek back to her link-up. 3 days later, Senior Chief Rowan Hale found her in the dining facility at FOB Halberd. He didn't apologize, SEALs rarely do, but he sat down across from her and admitted her shooting had saved lives, that he'd been wrong about her. He said it plain, without softening it, then tapped the rim of his coffee cup twice and asked how she managed those shots in that wind, at that distance. Lyra told him the truth: repetition, patience, and a father who'd taught her that a rifle doesn't care who's holding it. Hale nodded once, stood, and walked away. That was the end of their conversation, but not the end of what followed. Word spread fast among forward operators. Her company commander put her in for a Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with a combat distinguishing device. The citation detailed exactly what she'd done and why it mattered, backed by witness statements from Hale and 2 of his teammates. It moved up the chain with full documentation, and slowly the doubts that had shadowed her began to fade. She wasn't the woman who might be a liability anymore. She was the Marine who'd pulled an entire SEAL team out of a kill zone with precision fire from a rifle most couldn't master. When her deployment ended, Lyra rotated stateside and eventually left active duty. She became a civilian firearms instructor, teaching law enforcement and soldiers the same lessons her father had drilled into her. She didn't talk much about that night in the Cavera Valley, but those who were there never forgot. And Senior Chief Rowan Hale made sure every new shooter under his command heard the story of the Marine who proved that skill has no gender, and that in combat, assumptions don't just offend, they kill. If stories like this hit you right in the gut, go ahead and subscribe to Major Tom's Tales. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, because there are more real stories like this one waiting to be told.